You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. As Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. You can make this possible. Before the Civil War, colonizers and black laws threatened to deport former slaves born in the United States. African-American activists argued that citizenship was their birthright. Former slaves studied law, secured allies, and conducted themselves like citizens, establishing their status through local, everyday claims. As part of our continuing series, 1619 to 2019, Still Seeking Freedom, we're talking with Martha Jones, Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University, about birthright citizenship. Certainly glad to have you with us, Martha. This is relevant because we have seen in the last few years, especially with Trump in the White House, how Republicans have been targeting birthright citizenship, how they want to change the laws because historically how black folks were able to demand rights based upon that. And now what they really want to do is limit this really to white folks from other countries. And so this has a long history of how immigration laws and this birthright citizenship clause has been used against people of color.
The story really begins with the ways in which Black Americans are looking to, in a sense, forestall precisely what we see happening in our own time, which is to say, as you said, colonization, black laws are all aimed at, in essence, deporting, or in 19th century parlance, removing Black Americans from the country. And they come to this idea, this concept, this principle of birthright as a way to forestall their removal. Theirs is the first chapter, but only the first chapter in the ways in which the American state has used race and racism to attempt to curtail or to narrow who is a citizen, who can belong.
And so what should we know about this history, what you have laid out, and its impact on African Americans seeking freedom in this country?
This is a story from which we learn that there's nothing new in the United States about communities of color facing threats, living under the specter of deportation. We don't have to imagine what the world is like without birthright citizenship, because for the first decades in this nation, all the way through to the Civil War, Black Americans live without that protection and hence subject to the arbitrary whims of the state, of white supremacy, and of a nation that really wants to ensure that its future is a white republic. So when we see today lawmakers chipping away at birthright citizenship, threatening birthright citizenship, and we've heard that whether it's from the White House or from Congress, when we hear that, we need to know that that's an old story. That's an old tactic, and we need to, in my view, double down on birthright as an important, not a thorough and not the only bulwark, but an important bulwark against the force of racism in our regime of national belonging.
And so when you see what is happening right now, this is what I say is absolutely, truly about white supremacy. This is Stephen Miller. This is Donald Trump. These are these individuals who see where we're going. We're 24 years away from America becoming a nation majority of people of color. We're seeing the birth rate in this country, whites, is extremely low. We see that in 17 states in this country, the annual white death rate is higher than the annual white birth rate. This is about maintaining America as a white country.
Birthright citizenship is, in 1868, an intervention right, in that long history of white supremacy by transforming 4.5 million Black Americans, millions of them having been enslaved, into citizens. Yes. But the thing I want to say to you about your story is that, in fact, this is a 21st century problem that even predates the Trump administration. The noise around challenging, chipping away at, doing away with birthright citizenship really predates the Trump administration. Every year since 2009, Congress has had before it what's termed the Birthright Citizenship Act, which would exempt the children of unauthorized immigrants from birthright citizenship. So we have been living with the threat of this regime for a long time. But of course, you're correct that since President Trump's election, now this is an idea that really has traction. And we're seeing it not yet in the form of an executive order, not yet in the form of an act of Congress, but we know that even today in our midst, there are our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers who carry with them literally reams of paper, knowing that they may be arbitrarily stopped, arbitrarily confronted by immigration officers, and subject to detention as they try and prove the fact of their birth in the United States. So this era has arrived, and we need to be vigilant about the ways in which it is beginning by targeting some of the most vulnerable Americans.
Question, Julian.
But we don't know where it ends.
Right. Julian, go ahead.
What we've seen with immigration laws is a shrinking of the people of color coming in and an expansion of the white people. I forget the congressman who actually said any Irish person who had a high school diploma could come in. But meanwhile, for people from the African continent, from Latin America, had to have more credentials to come in. Do you see much of that in terms of the birthright citizenship?
Absolutely, because part of the story of the early 19th century is about the kind of discretion that low-level officials enjoy and exercise every day. By the time we get to the second half of the 19th century, this is a story that will center on the children of Chinese immigrants. And there what we know is that the citizenship of those people is not challenged by the Supreme Court or by the president. It is port officials in San Francisco who determine for themselves that they think Chinese Americans born in the U.S. are not citizens and are going to detain them, harass them, and jail them, and they will have to go to the U.S. Supreme Court to have their citizenship affirmed. So there is an important resonance, and the lesson is that this kind of regime begins perhaps not at the top, right, but at the bottom.
Greg?
Professor Jones, first of all, thank you for your work. It's quite fortuitous that your long years of research and study came out in the form of the book, just as this became something that's in the national conversation. So, you know, ancestors don't make any mistakes. That's very important, so thank you. And I'm glad you brought up that late 19th century, Chinese Exclusion Act, and then into the 20th century, trying who's white, who's not white. You know, I love this phrase that you've introduced, regime of national belonging. Thinking about Stephen Miller, who of course was on Jeff Sessions' staff before he transitioned to the next white supremacist, and Sessions, who's now trying to come back into the federal legislature from Alabama, and their obsession with the Immigration and Nationalization Act of 1965. How do you think through our commitments as non-white people in a country where this regime of national belonging seems to sit at the center of our aspirations? In other words, I guess what I'm asking is, you've done so much work on this question of birthright citizenship. How do you think through us coming up with definitions of national belonging that can displace whiteness and maybe ultimately even citizenship as the standard for determining our humanity in this project? I don't know if that makes any sense. It's just difficult for us to think, because we got black people and brown people who will side with these white supremacists because citizenship for them means national belonging.
Yes. So I think that there are two things. You know, the people I write about are really in many ways improvisational on this, and which is to say that they read the Constitution and the language in the Constitution, but they are also cognizant, for example, of the ways in which they believe their labor, much of it unrequited labor, entitles them to unqualified national belonging. They turn to military service, and many of them have served their fathers in the American Revolutionary era, themselves in the War of 1812. And they make the argument that military service should also be a basis for national belonging. And at the same time, I think you're right that in some sense, the people I write about are trying to solve an urgent problem. They are not political philosophers, if I could say that. They are practical
The
men
show is
and
called
women.
Unfiltered. You can say it.
They are practical men and women who are facing a brutal regime and the real threat of being forcibly removed from the United States. And they are prepared to make all of them in another day and in another time, great lawyers, right? They're prepared to make the argument that will stick. And it turns out in the 19th century, the argument that sticks is one about the Constitution and birthright, and they go with that. In our own time, I don't think that birthright is the answer. That's what, in part, I take from Dr. Carr's comment, that birthright isn't enough. And we live in an era when we have fully available to us a human rights vision that would say, for example, family relations should be part of a regime of rights, of human dignity. And so as we see families separated at the border, as we see children detained separate from their parents, we understand that even 19th century Black Americans understood the pain and the indignity of a state that would interfere with the intimacy of family relations. So there's a great deal more available to us when we pull back, I think, and begin to think about a framework like human rights, like human dignity, which may indeed include a regime that is grounded in labor, that is grounded in birth, that is grounded in military service, but it may expand to many other qualifiers as well.
Eugene, you have a question?
Yes.
Yes. So, there's a big movement now to just end birthright citizenship. How do you see that playing into the end game here?
I don't think it's a movement to end birthright citizenship, frankly. What I think it is saber rattling that is trying to condition us so that when birthright is not done away with, but when it is limited by excluding the children of unauthorized immigrants, we will say, well, maybe they weren't quite citizens in the way that I am, born in New York City.
That's right.
And that is what's going on, right? We are being conditioned. No one is going to countenance or get away with, if you will, abrogating the 14th Amendment. But the narrowing of the interpretation of that amendment is what this moment is about. And they're coming for the children of unauthorized immigrants first and foremost.
Martha Jones, Society of Black Alumni, Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. We appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.
All right, folks, back to our Roland Unfiltered video in just one moment. Fam, it's the holiday season. This is when you think about spending time with your family and friends. This is also when you count your blessings and support those less fortunate. This year, become a holiday hero and change someone's life forever. Right now, hundreds of thousands of Americans are sitting in jail without being convicted of a crime. Why? Because they can't pay their bail. Think about it. If you are arrested for any minor offense and you go to jail, if you don't have the money, you got to stay there until a court date is scheduled. That could be weeks, that could be days, weeks, or even months. Some black folks were there for years. Simply put, America's bail system is broken for people of color. Freedom should be free, folks. That's why the Ebony Foundation is partnered with the Bail Project and is sponsoring the Home by the Holiday campaign. The Bail Project has helped bail out thousands of people over the years, and with your help, they plan to bail out 1,000 people by New Year's Day. What they want you to do is make a donation anywhere from $25, $50 to $50 or more to do so. Now, of course, people of color represents anywhere from 50 to 90% of the jail population across the country. Now, check this out. Without bail, nearly 90% of those charged with misdemeanors plead guilty because they're trying to get out. However, when bail is paid, less than 2% receive a jail sentence. Sometimes justice just need us. If you want to donate, folks, and help the Ebony Foundation, go to homebytheholiday.com. That's homebytheholiday.com. Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video.